Joined now by Mark Stephenson. He's the Director of Dairy Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mark, thanks for taking the time.
You're very welcome, Bernard. Glad to be here.
Now, you and I have talked trade. It seems like every year I come down to the World Dairy Expo, and we actually have something to talk about now. The USMCA, the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, the new NAFTA, shall we say. A lot of buzz on the weekend, a lot of flurry of activity. You've had a chance to look at it. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, for a very unconventional start to trade talks, I think we probably had a fairly conventional kind of conclusion to the outcome here. It's not too much different than I might have expected from the beginning. You always start with the most extreme endpoint, as in, boy, Canada's got to dismantle their milk quota system and open up those borders, and but the outcome is never going to be at that endpoint either.
How big of a win is this for the U.S.? I know, 3.59% access to the Canadian market. The National Milk Producers Association called it incremental progress. How do you see it?
Well, I think we would have to call it incremental progress. I would agree with that characterization, which is to say, I think the dairy farmers are not going to look at their milk checks and see dollars in their milk checks as a result of this. It's going to be pennies and maybe nickels, somewhere along the way. But it's a fairly small impact on milk prices here in the U.S. This is additional market access for some specific products. I think there's still details to be ironed out as to what those products actually are and what they mean. They're using terminology that's not really standard, and when we actually get harmonized tariff schedule numbers, we'll know a little bit more about what those products are.
Now, Canadian dairy farmers, I think, expected to give away a little market access. They were surprised to see Class 6, Class 7 be sort of ripped out of there. Your thoughts on that and the impact of that?
Well, I think you're losing Class 6 and 7 by name for sure. That's something that was considered fairly toxic down here. But there's mechanism in place still to be pricing ingredients going into certain milk protein products that I think will effectively mean that the milk protein isolate that had been coming up into Canada is not going to be all that attractive for us to be sending up any longer. So it accomplishes the same thing that the Class 6, 7 pricing did before from that standpoint. What it probably also does, though, is that it caps the amount of product that can be priced under the former Class 6, 7 and sold onto world markets with skim milk powder, for example.
I just want to go back to, I guess, the reaction. I mean, President Trump really pushed this, obviously, from an access. It started right here in Wisconsin, a lot of that movement. We've got some, troublesome times here in Wisconsin, across the nation, dairy farmers. Just a sense of, what type of an impact this can have again. Is it something that, U.S. dairy farmers are really grabbing onto, is maybe, the thin edge of the wedge, the way to more milk markets for a lot of milk that we have in this country?
Well, any large growth that the U.S. has in product sales are not likely to be domestic sales. They're going to be exports. That's what sustained a lot of our growth over the last decade and more. And as we look forward, I think we have to expect that. Now, I don't think that we're looking at any kind of tsunami of milk coming up into Canada from Wisconsin or New York. It's going to be a dribble more that will be coming up in the way of product sales. So I think that for the disappointed dairy farmers of Canada, I wouldn't really say that you sacrifice the dairy industry there, on the altar of automotive industry. I think that, you gave up something. We gave up some things as well, and that's the way that trade negotiations really work.
Canadian farmers have been sort of adding up the market access that's been sort of going away from WTO, CETA, this one, you're getting into 17 and 18% of the Canadian market starting to be given away. And dairy farmers are worried about, what the future is. And then the Class 6 and Class 7 going away. Should they fear the U.S.?
I don't know that you should fear the U.S. I mean, there was an incremental increase in the amount of product that's going to be able to come up into Canada, phased in over a 6-year time period with modest increments after that. So there is going to be some opportunity for a little bit more in the way of sales. I think increasingly it's going to be important for Canada to stop and realize, our milk pricing system is very different than really any other country in the world, major milk producer in the world. Can we be an island? And if we can't, then how do we transition? So I would tell Canadian dairy farmers a couple of things, at least from my observations. One is that the country has incredible agronomic resources for producing milk. We would lust after a lot of the land and the climate that's there to support a dairy industry. It's perfect for that along those borders. And the restriction of the quota is something that has been probably the thing that's held milk production down. If the quota weren't there, and if you survived the hits to the balance sheet and some of the other things, Canada, in my opinion, has a ripe future in terms of milk production. I'm not suggesting that Canada should give up quota system anytime soon. It's been valuable to them, and if you do, how do you do this with a glide path that makes it tolerable for folks to get from where they are now to where they would need to be then?
A final question for you, and that is, how do you see this thing sort of rolling out over the next 6 months, the next year? What's your, vision of how this sort of is enacted?
I think it happens slowly. There's a lot of language that needs to be clarified. There's a lot of implementation rules that need to be put in place. For example, the caps on what you can export to other countries and by product types and things. We have to have all those mechanisms in place, both to monitor that and to make sure that compliance is being done. I think the implementation happens, but there are people in place in both countries that are used to dealing with this, and that will continue to roll out over time. I think the one thing that I feel personally a little bit sorry about is that Canada has been a close friend of the United States for a very, very long time. And it seems to me that some of this friendship was roughly treated during the time period we were going through this negotiation. I would hope that we don't feel over the long run that this is something that's not reparable.
Well said, Mark. Hey, and thank you, and really appreciate you taking the time.
You're very welcome.